Hi, my name is Kelli Anderson, and for my vulnerable populations presentation, I'm going to be talking about individuals with visual impairment. So the CDC defines individuals with visual impairment as people with correctable and uncorrectable blindness and low vision. And according to the World Health Organization, 80% of blindness around the world can be prevented or treated. So as far as population size, in Davis, Salt Lake, Summit, and Tooele counties, around 20,000 people are blind or visually impaired. And in the state of Utah, about 50,000 individuals. Across the U.S., there are 32.2 million. And then internationally, the World Health Organization says that 2.2 billion people have impaired vision. Roughly 1 billion of these cases can be prevented. As I said, that's that 80%. So some social determinants of health that may affect these individuals is possible lack of education, difficulties with transportation because they're not able to drive, depending on how visually impaired they may be. So they might be very dependent on public transportation, which if they live in an area where that's not available, then they are just going to have to rely on people around them who can drive, which can be an issue. I did read an article about a program that's in the London public transportation system where visually impaired people can have a free pass to public transportation in order to decrease the ill effects that the inability to drive has on these individuals. And then they also might have a lack of economic stability depending on whether or not they are able to find employment that they can both do with their blindness and find an employer who is willing to work with them. Stigma and prejudice can be a big issue for blind individuals. So as I was saying, they are very dependent on public transportation. And then they might have education difficulties. So in the state of Utah, there are only 3 campuses for the Utah Schools of Deaf and Blind, which are in Salt Lake, Ogden, and Springville. That leaves a pretty big geographic area in the state of Utah, especially in more rural areas in Utah. So, if a child is born who has blindness, then if their family doesn't live close to that school, then they're going to have some problems with their education. And those schools do serve individuals anywhere from 0 to 22 years old. And as I was saying, sometimes finding work can be difficult for these individuals. So the root causes of these social determinants of health, like I said, they might not have public transportation, especially in more rural areas. And then if they don't live near the campuses for blind schools, then they're going to be limited on their education that they can receive. And then employment opportunities. Oh, excuse me. Employment opportunities may be limited just because of bias and prejudice. But also these individuals can have some serious self-esteem issues, especially if their blindness is something relatively new to them. For whatever reason, if it's more of a recent issue that they've developed, then they might really not have the self-confidence that they need to go back to work. And they can also have problems getting to and from work. As far as Maslow's hierarchy of needs, depending on different circumstances, for the most part, these individuals' physiological needs can be met. It just kind of will depend on their financial circumstances and maybe the support system that they have around them. They might have difficulty finding employment or having property. And then they might have some serious insecurity about their safety, especially because they might feel unsafe in their home. They might feel unsafe walking around their neighborhoods, being a pedestrian with visual impairments. And then they also just might have they might feel like a social outcast because of their blindness, and they may lack self-esteem and not be able to achieve self-actualization. Some people can be born with blindness, but then diseases such as, cataracts, glaucoma, macular degeneration are probably going to occur later in life. So it might be that someone's been able to see their entire lives, but then this problem sets in that really can upset their whole world. And then their anticipated level of function, it's just really going to depend on how experienced they are navigating their environment, and the support system that they have around them. So communicable diseases, they aren't necessarily more susceptible to getting communicable diseases, but one disease that is communicable that causes blindness is trachoma, which results from a chlamydia infection. It affects 1.9 people worldwide, and this can be treated with surgery, antibiotics to treat chlamydia infections, and just preventing the spread of the disease. It can be passed from mother to child. And then non-communicable diseases, like I talked about, these are some common causes of blindness: glaucoma, macular degeneration, or diabetic retinopathy. And then another common cause that the CDC talks about, or another common disease that the CDC talks about, is depression. The CDC states that there are higher rates of depression amongst visually impaired individuals than in the general population. So some self-care problems. So they do have to be careful around their homes. They're at a higher risk for falls, so they need to keep their homes clutter-free. They can cut themselves while cooking. They can burn themselves while cooking. Some tips for living safely in a home while being visually impaired include putting your pots on the stove before you turn on the burner so that you don't have to feel around a hot burner. Turn handles away. And they just have to be more aware of the risks that are around them. And then another interesting thing is that it can be difficult for them to take their medications because they can't read the labels, so their medication bottles need to be marked with some kind of tactile marking so they know they can feel which medication they're taking. I remember talking about early on in nursing school, talking about how insulin pens have been such a positive thing for visually impaired people with diabetes because they can listen to the clicks and know how many units they're giving themselves. And then another issue that they need to, a risk for harm that they have is being a pedestrian when vision impaired. One article I read talked about how roundabouts are really high risk just because pedestrians and roundabouts, they can be hard for people who are driving to see, so it's important that roundabouts implement pedestrian activated signs so that cars can know that there's a pedestrian in the sidewalk. And those are my references.